The Bible is full of emotions. In fact, it only takes a few chapters to really start digging into what the human experience is and the things that we feel, and even discovering how God can feel. But I want to lift up one particular scripture reading today, and this might be the shortest scripture reading you've heard in a long time before a sermon. It comes from John, the Gospel of John, chapter 11. Now, you can hear this scripture and think of it as a discouraging thing, but I actually see it as quite hopeful. Really, really hopeful. In that God knows what it's like to feel. That God knows what it's like to experience the things that we experience. So John chapter 11, verse 5 says this, two simple words. Jesus wept. Before becoming a member of the Church of the Brethren and a pastor, I spent several years working in a state hospital back in Virginia, which is my home state. I started out as a behavioral specialist there. Now, what my team would do is we served as a high-risk team that would go into a unit, and they would help folks that were in the hospital's care address behaviors that were problematic in the larger community. We would work through positive reinforcement to help that person see their behavior, reshape their behavior, and really own their new behaviors. I worked with some of the best psychologists and psychiatrists in the state. Incredible, incredible people. It was hard and it was painful work, but it was also extremely fulfilling and really rewarding when we would see individuals come in at what they would say was their worst. But then just a short time later, they would go back out at what they would say was their best. It was a beautiful thing seeing the recovery model at work, knowing that people were always deserving of a new start, of a fresh start, of a new chance at living their lives whole and full. Later, I started to teach classes at the hospital on emotional stability and emotional regulation. I would help individuals recognize their feelings as cues coming from within themselves that was really trying to say something about their experience. Cues as what their inner self was saying about their environment and those around them. It's good to notice these types of feelings and use them to grow, to understand yourself in a fuller way. I love that class. It was always a very full class. We usually had to find places for people to sit because, quite honestly, this is something that each and every one of us deals with on a day-to-day basis. But how we deal with it can really, really vary. The most popular feelings that we would talk about in the group were, of course, sadness, and then the infamous anger. And these can often serve as what are called secondary emotions. They're typically a feeling that is a reaction from a prior feeling. See, we are physical, relational, intellectual, but very emotional creatures. The blueprint of the human psyche is all the proof that I need to know that God's blueprints are deep and complex and so, so beautiful. It was during my time as a hospital liaison where I learned, somewhat unfortunately, what others think about mental health outside of the walls of hospitals. Right before seminary, I landed what I was convinced was my dream job. I was so happy to get it. I was a community liaison. And essentially what I would do is we would get a call that someone in the Charlottesville area had been admitted to the hospital, likely at UVA, and then ultimately would end up at Western State. And it was my job to serve as their bridge into recovery and back into the community. So I represented for them their supports once they were out of the hospital, putting in place things like mental health workers' benefits, making sure that they had a stable program and a stable system of getting things like their medicines, and especially continuing to see doctors, therapists, and counselors. I was good at that job. And sometimes I think about it. I miss it. It was extremely hard and again, but very rewarding work. I learned a lot in that point in my life. And again, I think the most painful thing I walked away learning was that there are so many in our community that have a really unhealthy stigma about folks that are dealing with issues surrounding mental health, surrounding mental illness, and surrounding emotional health and well-being. We are not very good as a collective society in normalizing these kinds of conversations, in naming this as part of the human experience. How we can regulate our emotions or even just own and name our emotions in ways that get us to a healthy point in living our lives, rather than turning to things like self-medication. And I'll get to that in a moment. There's so much shame involved in issues surrounding mental health or mental illness. And I think that it's our job to correct some of those understandings of what's going on. The mentality is that people need to get it together, right? Folks with emotional instability need to be out of sight and out of mind. We don't like it particularly when folks interrupt our just normal, on-the-go, hectic way of living. Very rarely do we ourselves stop to address or help someone that's experiencing these kinds of moments. And so should we be normalizing mental health, emotional health? Yes. Yes. And for me, that was one of the earliest ways that I was able to connect with the Scriptures. Because I saw layered and complex, and let's be honest, oftentimes off-putting characters in the Bible. Scriptures are full of fascinating, layered people that are putting human emotions on full display, almost on every single page. We find anger in the story of two brothers found in Genesis. Cain feels deep, deep envy for what his brother Abel has, and he reacts. Abraham fears for his life in front of Abimelech, and so lies about his wife Sarah. Hagar feels alone in the wilderness after being sent out of Abraham's camp, but there she discovers in the midst of her emotions a God that sees her. King Saul becomes depressed when he hears God's message that he has somehow been rejected as king. And so we have an account of his feeling of rejection and how hard that was for him. There are things like greed in the Scriptures. There's plenty of references to lust. Hello, King David. And then there's guilt. Deep, deep guilt that Judas feels after betraying Jesus. Such a deep emotion he encounters to the point of taking his own life. But on the other side, there are so many things like joy. There's affection. There's loyalty that we see clearly on display just in the book of Ruth. As God's imagers, it is no wonder that we experience emotions because, as we learn also from Scripture, God feels different. It feels deeply. God is an emotional being. God's heart is mentioned as feeling grieved. God also experiences pleasure. God experiences satisfaction in the good created order that He's put together for us. Psalm 2 verse 4 references God laughing. I like to think about God laughing. Jesus Himself wore His emotions on His sleeve. It wasn't very difficult, especially as the gospel authors portray Jesus. You kind of get a sense for how He's feeling in most of the moments as He goes about His ministry. Jesus Himself feels things like compassion. He feels anger. He weeps. He knows agony. He knows anguish. He knows love. He knows joy. He knows loneliness. Why will no one stay awake with me? I like in Mark how Jesus sighs. And over the gospel writers to record an account of Jesus just... I imagine Jesus even had a few moments where He rolled His eyes, which makes Jesus the most relatable guy for us. Jesus is once again a positive role model for how we model healthy emotions. He was set up as such a deep feeler. And I think that that's a significant lesson for all of us in the church to consider. Jesus reminds us that we cannot forget or set aside the psychological ramifications of our lives and our faith. There is a very real intersection between our faith and psychology and how God can and does speak through the things that we feel. One of the reasons I like Jesus so much is because Jesus is hard at work normalizing mental health through His healings, through His teaching, through His role modeling. Alison Cook was on an episode of one of my favorite podcasts called The Bible for Normal People. It's a great podcast. Please check out the podcast that I'm referencing now in the sermon. I'm going to have Jason post it in the chat. You can listen to it anywhere. It's also available on your phones. It's a really great episode that addresses a lot of what we're talking about today. She talks about how many are conditioned to ignore or suppress feelings that she has actually experienced that sort of behavior within the walls of her own church. Alison Cook is a psychologist. She's a PhD. And she leads in some interesting discussions on how psychology and therapy intersect with faith and a life in God. She was too used to hearing things like facts, then faith, then feelings, growing up in church. She mentions this interesting idea of something called spiritual bypassing, an unfortunate way of moving quickly through feelings that we encounter and avoiding the pain that may come with those feelings by placing a Band-Aid that looks and sounds a lot like a platitude. And she said that this is a real danger that the church can practice. This is something that's very unhelpful to people who are seeking a deeper understanding of who they are and how God is helping them feel. So it's like when folks try to make us feel better and they mean well, and as we say in Virginia, bless their hearts. You might hear something like, and her example was this: look, you don't need to feel sad. God has given you so much to be thankful for. Yes, but also unhelpful to rush through something as serious as sadness, to rush through something as serious as grief. Another that you may hear is that you don't need to feel anger. Anger is a sin, and we have got to pray that sin away from you. This really minimizes the authentic emotional experience that deserves full attention. We do this to ourselves. We are good at masking the pain that our own emotions can cause us to encounter. Painful or negative emotions are viewed as sinful and bad. I heard that at an early age. And the problem is we become to rely or trust or fear our own emotions a bit too much. We might even forget in our suppressing those emotions how to properly process them. One of the examples I gave folks at the hospital was we had a drawer at our house where we would try to be good stewards, and when we would actually get a grocery bag from the store, we would save it so that we could reuse it later down the road. The problem is over time you use fewer bags than you actually take in. We've gotten a lot better about that at the Landrum house. But what we did is we would open this drawer and we would take those bags and we would sit them in there and we'd close it back up. Well, over time it gets a lot harder to fit those bags into that drawer until one day you open the drawer and they fly out everywhere making a mess. And you don't know what to do with them. This is exactly what we do to our emotions and our feelings. And this is exactly the kind of behavior that can leave us to an unstable mental health. It's too easy to set it aside and forget. It's too easy to just turn to other things so that we can quickly feel better. We should be dealing with these things within ourselves when we feel them as cues. I think Jesus wants us to face these parts of ourselves. Alison's best point for me in the podcast, in the interview, that she points out that Jesus clearly calls us to love our enemies. What if Jesus was calling us to love even the enemies that reside within us? The enemies that live in our upstairs, in our mind, in our conscious and unconscious minds. The voices that we come to either mistrust or trust too much. What if He wants us to love those enemies that live inside of us? And just like we are called to love our neighbors and our enemies in a transformative way, what if we invested more time in loving these parts of ourselves to a point of transformation and deeper understanding? Imagine the difficult job we have when we learn to love those voices in our heads to the place of pure transformation and truth. Most of the folks I worked with at Western were being lied to by their own inner feelings. They were constantly telling themselves that you're not good enough, or you're broken because you feel and act this way, or that you'll never be able to contribute anything good to the larger society, that you may as well give up or just do whatever you want. It's tough work helping people through those enemies that live within themselves. Imagine naming the voice or feeling that convinces you that you are unloved, that you are unlikable, and that you are alone. That feeling of shame that has somehow tricked you into thinking you'll appear weak if you reveal any of this to another person. And we can be conditioned at an early age to feel that shame when we fail. When we fail to exude that our life isn't just great but perfect. We must always appear to have our lives in proper working order, especially when around others. And especially when we go to church on Sunday mornings. Put on the happy face, we're told. No wonder folks turn to things like self-medication. We feel sad and we think we shouldn't, so we decide to eat the entire box of Turkey Hill ice cream. And that's a high risk for us brethren, as I throw in a brethren cliche, thank you. Because that will fix us. We'll feel better if we do that. Or we feel anxious, so we run off to Target and we buy something to mask the pain that we're feeling in the moment. We consume substances in an effort to numb ourselves so that we won't feel. We can even consume church as a way of masking or just covering the things we feel deeply within ourselves. That if I go to church, if I pray, if I listen to the sermons, if I do everything that's on the checklist, that maybe somehow I will feel better. When we hurt in this way, that is when we could potentially begin to hurt other people. A good friend reminded me this week, hurt people hurt people. Now, I want to speak to the fellas for just a moment because I think we've been brought up with some kind of understanding that to talk about our feelings or even our own mental health is a sign of weakness somehow. Boys don't cry, at least that's what we're told. Buck up and be a man, shake it off and get back in the game. Be like Tim the Toolman Taylor, or however he grunts. That's the model of what it means to be a man. And then too often, society misattributes that women are overly emotional. They have no control of their emotions. Also not true. In fact, it's the women in my life that have taught me how to name the emotions that I feel, to process them better on a deeper level. We need a space to process and understand those emotional and mental cues within ourselves. Our emotions are trying to tell us something, and we must learn to listen to them well. That view of hiding emotions isn't very biblical either. There are some really emotional people, as I mentioned earlier in the Bible, and many of them need a really, really good therapist. I think, too, that it's important we model, like Jesus did, an emotional vulnerability with one another, especially within the walls of the church, especially in our places of faith. So for my main point, as I attempt to wrap this up, because we were talking about how we could have an entire sermon series on this topic, the church needs to be good at talking about mental health and about emotion. My main point is this. I think that the church is the perfect place, really, to help humans name and decipher the feelings we wrestle with in our day-to-day living. I think we should be the number one safe place for people to bring not their perfect selves, but their growing selves. And to do that, we have to be a little more honest with each other. Maybe it doesn't mean we always have to put on a happy face when we gather. Maybe it means we have to develop a level of trust and respect that where we can feel open to share, but also willing and ready to just listen to someone. And resist the urge for the cheap platitude, but really sit with someone in where they are. The risk is that we lose this ministry and discipleship opportunity when we create a culture, even within the church, that everything is perfect in our lives, when it's not. Let's acknowledge that grief is a process, and it's often a really lengthy process. Let's be cool with taking our time with grief, because far too often we want to rush others through that. And then we begin to wonder what's wrong with them that they're still sad. It's grief. It's serious. Let's work to normalize mental health and talking about how we feel with one another. Normalize mental health. What a way to be known in the world as the church. That they've normalized the way people feel and they work together on those feelings because it's a normal part of being a human being. And let's avoid the temptation to be anything like Job's friends, trying to band-aid the experience or point out his faults or explain away why he's feeling the way he's feeling. Because sometimes when people are in a place of crisis, they just need someone to love them through listening. And so the church is the perfect place to grow through what we are going through. Now, all this being said, I want to be sure that we as a church avoid some of the pitfalls. This kind of self-discovery takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of introspection. This is not something where one Sunday is going to magically fix the way you feel. But it's our hope as pastors and as church leaders to help people discover the tools that lead to health, that lead to wholeness, that lead to resources that really can provide the level of transformation that we seek. Christians should have lots of grace with one another, a deep sense of trust that leads to a deep sense of belonging in the end. And you know, a 20-minute sermon should not be your therapist every week. That's not really what we're trying to do. We do you and the community a disservice when we just throw out things that continually make us feel good, but rather deal with the ambivalence and the ambiguity and the difficulties of life and how we can get through them together through the message Jesus has given the church. Sometimes God is going to bring you wholeness through prayer. Sometimes God's going to bring you wholeness through a sermon. Sometimes God's going to bring you wholeness through a Bible study. And sometimes, as Alison Cook says, God is going to do all of that healing and wholeness through a therapist. And that's okay. That's okay. Let's engage with one another. Let's be supportive as we do the heavy lifting of self-discovery, of community discovery. Let's encourage one another as we do the hard work of loving and working to transform those enemies that live within ourselves. Let's love them too. I'm going to end with a story from some of my final days working at the hospital. We would have frequent team meetings with some of the folks we were serving, their doctors, some of their community supports. It was alarming how many of them had to endure their treatment alone. They had no one in their corner. They had no one to support them, to hear them out, and often that led to a lot of emotional and mental health trauma. But there was one time I remember I was working with a particular client. In every team meeting, she had 4 guests in her treatment planning conference. 4. And she would proudly introduce who they were every time. She would go around and say their names, and then she would always say, "These are folks that go to my church." And they would sit there and they would listen with her. They would support her. They would offer her encouraging words. They would excite her towards her recovery. And then they would continue to love her fully once she was out of the hospital. I find great hope in knowing that the people that Jesus has called to love are feeling that love through the support of the community that's normalizing that it's okay not to be okay. We've all been there. We'll carry you because people have carried us before. We've learned to wrestle with the same things that you're encountering now, and so we know that you can do that too. Jesus wept. Such comfort for the church to know that Jesus feels so deeply to the point of showing and feeling loneliness, but then also joy. Knowing that Jesus also felt anger, but Jesus also knows love. Jesus knew the feeling of acceptance as he knew the feeling of rejection. And Jesus knew how the disciples were feeling, especially after his crucifixion and in the resurrection, which is why he's constantly ministering to them. Peace. Feel peace. And so thank you for this Sermon on Demand. I'm excited to see what my colleagues pick. And I'm excited to see what we continue to normalize in the church. An act of resistance to say, no, we stand with those that folks often feel alone. That we stand with those in need of healing, and that we stand with them. Why? Because we too know what it's like to grow in that way. Love your enemies as yourselves. Love them to the point of transformation, even when they reside within.